In the spring of the year 180, in a military camp on the Danube frontier, an old man was dying of plague. He was 58 years old. He had spent the last 13 years of his life in tents like this one, on frontiers like this one, fighting wars he had never wanted against enemies who kept coming. He was the most powerful man on earth, and he had written privately in Greek in a notebook he never intended anyone to read that power was a kind of smoke and that he would rather have been left alone to study. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and he ruled an empire that stretched from the reign of northern Britain to the deserts beyond Egypt, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the headwaters of the Tigris. Something like 60 million people lived inside its borders. A merchant could sail from Alexandria to Ostia without changing currency. A letter could travel from York to Antioch along paved roads, through a system of relay stations in something under 2 months. In the cities of the East, aqueducts brought water to fountains that ran day and night. In the towns of Gaul and Spain, men who had never seen Italy wrote Latin, worshipped Roman gods, and thought of themselves without hesitation as Romans. There had been nothing like it before. There would be nothing like it again in the West for well over 1,000 years. And in that tent on the Danube, at the very moment the empire reached the outer limit of what it could hold, it was already carrying the thing that would take it apart. To understand what happened next, it helps to understand what Rome had accidentally discovered about how to choose a ruler. For most of the 2nd century, the empire had passed from one emperor to the next by adoption. Nerva adopted Trajan, a soldier from Spain, and Trajan turned out to be the finest general Rome ever put on the throne. Trajan adopted Hadrian, who stopped the expansion and built the walls. Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius, whose reign was so quiet that historians have almost nothing to say about it, which is the highest compliment the ancient world could pay. And Antoninus adopted Marcus. 4 transitions, no civil wars, 4 consecutive emperors of real ability, chosen as adults on the basis of what they had already proven they could do. Later, Romans looked back on that century as a golden age, and they were not entirely wrong. But it is worth being honest about why it worked, because the Romans themselves were not entirely honest about it. It worked because none of those men had a living son. Nerva was childless. Trajan was childless. Hadrian's marriage produced nothing. Antoninus Pius had 2 sons, and both of them died young. Every one of those celebrated adoptions was made by a man with no biological heir to prefer. The system was not a philosophical achievement. It was a run of luck, dressed up afterward as wisdom. Marcus Aurelius had 13 children. One of his sons survived to adulthood. He was 19 years old when his father died, and his name was Commodus. Marcus had been preparing him for years. Commodus was made co-emperor at 16, given the tribunician power, paraded before the legions, married to a suitable woman, surrounded by the best tutors in the empire. Whatever else can be said about the succession, it was not careless. Marcus did what almost any father in the ancient world would have done, and what the constitution of the empire entirely permitted him to do. It was still a catastrophe. Commodus made peace on the Danube within months of his father's death, quickly and on terms that Marcus would probably not have accepted, and went home to Rome. He was not interested in frontiers. He was interested in Rome and in himself, and increasingly in a private mythology, in which he was not really an emperor at all, but a god walking among men. He renamed the months of the year after his own titles. He renamed Rome itself after himself. He had statues raised showing him as Hercules, with the lion skin and the club, and then he began to appear in public dressed that way, and he fought in the arena. This is the detail that has followed him for 18 centuries, and it deserves to be understood properly rather than simply enjoyed. Roman opinion did not object to the violence. Roman opinion objected to the class of it. The arena was for slaves, criminals, and professionals, people who had already lost their standing in society or never had any. For the emperor to descend into it was not brave. It was degrading in the specific way that a king cleaning stables would be degrading. He was throwing away the only thing that made the office work, which was the sense that the man holding it was categorically different from other men. He killed animals by the hundred in front of a senate legally required to attend and to applaud. He fought human opponents who understood perfectly well what would happen to them if they won. He took a gladiator's fee from the public treasury, an enormous one, and the treasury paid it. Meanwhile, the actual work of government was done by a rotating series of favorites, most of whom accumulated great wealth and were then executed when the accumulation became embarrassing. By the last day of the year, 192, the people closest to him had concluded that he intended to kill them. They may well have been right. They poisoned his food, and when the poison only made him vomit, they sent in a wrestler named Narcissus, who strangled him in his bath. He was 31. He had ruled for 12 years. And with him, the Antonine dynasty ended, and something far more dangerous began. The conspirators had a candidate ready, Pertinax, an experienced and respectable senator, the son of a freed slave, a man who had risen entirely on competence. He was proclaimed emperor on the first day of the year 193. He immediately tried to fix the finances. Commodus had emptied the treasury, and Pertinax began selling off the imperial luxuries, cancelling extravagances, imposing discipline. Among the extravagances he attempted to curtail were the privileges of the Praetorian Guard, the 9,000 elite soldiers stationed in Rome itself, the only substantial armed force in the city, and the men who had just been paid a large donative to accept his rule. They killed him on the 28th of March. He had reigned for 87 days. What happened next is one of those moments where the machinery of a state becomes briefly, horribly visible. The Praetorians withdrew to their fortified camp on the edge of the city, and from the walls, they announced that the empire was for sale. There were two serious bidders: Sulpicianus, who was Pertinax's father-in-law and happened to be inside the camp already, and Didius Julianus, an immensely wealthy senator, who came and stood outside the walls and shouted his offers upward. The bidding was conducted by heralds relaying figures between the two men. Julianus won by promising every soldier 25,000 sesterces, roughly 5 years of a legionary's pay, to each of 9,000 men. The gates opened. He was escorted to the Senate, which confirmed him, because the Senate had no army, and the men standing in the chamber did. He lasted 9 weeks. The problem with buying the throne from the Praetorian Guard was that the Praetorian Guard was 9,000 men, and the empire contained roughly 330,000 soldiers, most of them hardened frontier troops who had spent their careers on the Rhine, the Danube, and the Euphrates, while the Praetorians drew double pay for standing around the capital. 3 of the men commanding those frontier armies looked at what had just happened in Rome and drew the obvious conclusion: if the throne could be bought, it could be taken. The man who took it was Septimius Severus, governor of Upper Pannonia, born in North Africa, in a city on the coast of what is now Libya. He spoke Latin with an accent his enemies mocked. He commanded 16 legions within a few days' march of Italy, and he moved faster than anyone expected. He was in Rome by June. Julianus, abandoned by everyone, was executed in the palace by a common soldier. It then took Severus 4 more years to destroy his 2 rivals, Pescennius Niger in the east and Clodius Albinus in Gaul, whose army he shattered outside Lyon in a battle so close that Severus was unhorsed and nearly killed in the middle of it. And then, having won a civil war he had started by marching on the capital, Severus sat down to work out what had actually gone wrong. His diagnosis was correct. That is what makes what follows so difficult. He understood that the Senate no longer mattered, that the emperor's authority did not come from law or tradition or the consent of anyone in Rome. It came from soldiers, and only from soldiers, and every arrangement that pretended otherwise was decoration. Commodus had died because he lost the loyalty of his household. Pertinax had died because he tried to economize on men with swords. Julianus had died because 9,000 soldiers could not protect him from 300,000. So Severus stopped pretending. He disbanded the Praetorian Guard entirely, the whole institution dismissed and expelled from the city on pain of death, and rebuilt it from his own frontier legions, men personally loyal to him. He raised army pay for the first time in over a century. He made it legal for serving soldiers to marry, which formalized what had always happened anyway, and rooted the legions more deeply in the provinces where they were stationed. He opened the officer corps to men from the ranks so that a career soldier could rise into the administrative class. He stationed a legion in Italy itself, something no emperor had done. And he spent a great deal of money doing all of it. Every single one of these measures was a sensible response to a real problem. Together, they announced something that could not be taken back, that the army was not one institution of the Roman state among others. It was the state, and everything else was an expense. He died at York, in Britain, in the winter of 211, campaigning in Scotland at the age of 65. The advice he gave his 2 sons on his deathbed has come down to us in a single line, and it is the most honest sentence any Roman emperor ever spoke. Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, despise everyone else. The sons did not manage the first part. Caracalla and Geta hated each other so thoroughly that they had discussed formally dividing the empire between them, east and west, and were only talked out of it by their mother. Within a year, Caracalla arranged a reconciliation meeting in her apartments and had his brother cut down in front of her. Geta died in his mother's arms. She was forbidden to mourn him. Perhaps 20,000 people associated with Geta were hunted down and killed in the months that followed, and every image of him in the empire was chiseled out, so that on the surviving arches and inscriptions there is simply a gap where a face used to be. Caracalla then did as his father had advised, and raised army pay again, by half. It was more than the empire could afford, and he knew it, and in the year 212, he issued an edict that solved the problem. The Constitutio Antoniniana granted Roman citizenship to virtually every free inhabitant of the empire. On its face, this is one of the most generous acts in the history of the ancient world. Millions of people who had lived under Roman rule as subjects became, in a single stroke, Romans. With the legal protections, the standing in court, the name, it was the logical conclusion of something Rome had been doing for 800 years, which was absorbing the people it conquered rather than merely ruling them. The contemporary historian Cassius Dio, who was a senator and who watched it happen, says plainly that Caracalla did it for the money. Roman citizens paid inheritance tax. Non-citizens did not. Caracalla had just doubled that tax, and the edict multiplied the number of people liable to pay it. Both things are true at once. And that combination, a genuinely magnificent act performed for a squalid reason to fund a payment the state could not sustain, is very close to the whole character of the 3rd century. Caracalla was murdered 5 years later by an officer of his own guard at the roadside while relieving himself on a journey through Syria. What followed was 2 decades of increasing instability under increasingly unsuitable men. Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect who had arranged Caracalla's death, ruled for a year and never set foot in Rome. Elagabalus, a 14-year-old Syrian priest of a sun god, was installed by his grandmother, imported his deity into Rome as the supreme god of the empire, married a Vestal virgin, and was murdered by the Praetorians 4 years later, along with his mother. Their bodies dragged through the streets and thrown in the Tiber. His cousin, Alexander Severus, was 13 when he replaced him, and he was, by every account, a decent young man. He listened to advisors, he reduced taxes, he respected the Senate. Under different circumstances, he might have been remembered as a good emperor. But the circumstances were these. A new and aggressive Persian dynasty had replaced the old Parthian kingdom in the east, and the German tribes on the Rhine were moving. Alexander went east, fought an expensive and inconclusive campaign, and then hurried north to deal with the Germans. And on the Rhine, in the year 235, he decided that the cheapest and quickest solution was to pay them to go away. It was a defensible decision. Emperors had bought off barbarians before, and would do so many times again. But he made it in front of an army that had marched a very long way, expecting a campaign and plunder, and the donative that came with a victory. His own soldiers went into his tent at Moguntiacum and killed him, and killed his mother with him, and proclaimed as emperor a Thracian officer of enormous physical size and no aristocratic connections whatsoever, named Maximinus. Maximinus never went to Rome. He did not need to. The Senate confirmed him because there was nothing else the Senate could do. 55 years had passed since Marcus Aurelius died on the Danube. In that time, an empire that had transferred power peacefully for 4 generations had watched a son destroy his father's inheritance, watched the throne sold at auction from the walls of a barracks, watched a capable emperor conclude, correctly, that only the army mattered, and watched his heirs pay for that conclusion until the currency began to strain under the weight of it. And the men in the legions had learned the lesson that Severus taught them, and learned it far better than he intended. They had learned that an emperor was a man who paid them, and that if he stopped paying them, or paid them too little, or spent their war on diplomacy instead of plunder, they could go into his tent and kill him. They had learned that this carried no consequence. No unit was ever punished for it. There was no institution left with the standing to punish them, and the men who replaced the murdered emperor invariably needed those same soldiers too badly to ask questions. The empire had solved the problem of who commands the army by making the army the source of all authority. It was about to discover what that meant when the army stopped agreeing with itself. The soldiers who killed Alexander Severus in his tent had made a straightforward calculation. They wanted a commander who would fight, and they wanted the money that came with fighting, and the man they had was offering neither. So they replaced him. What they could not have understood is that they had just demonstrated a method. For the next half-century, every army in the empire would use it. The numbers are difficult to state precisely, because the definition of an emperor becomes genuinely unclear in this period. If you count only the men the Senate recognized, there were about 25. If you count every commander proclaimed by his troops who managed to issue coins in his own name before someone killed him, the figure is closer to 50. Of all of them, exactly 1 is recorded as having died of natural causes, and even that is disputed. 50 years, 50 emperors, 1 deathbed. This is the period that historians used to call the crisis of the 3rd century. And the name is accurate, but too tidy. It suggests a single problem. What actually happened was that 4 separate catastrophes arrived at the same time and began feeding each other, and the responses to each one made the others worse. Maximinus, the Thracian officer the soldiers had raised up on the Rhine, understood exactly one thing about his position. He owed it to the army, and he would keep it only as long as the army was paid and busy. So he fought successful campaigns in Germany, then on the Danube. And to fund them, he taxed the empire harder than it had been taxed in living memory. Temple treasuries were confiscated. Civic funds meant for grain distributions and public works were seized. Wealthy men in the provinces found their estates assessed at figures that bore no relation to what the land produced. He never went to Rome at all, not once in 3 years. He had no interest in the Senate and no need of it, and the Senate understood the message perfectly. In the year 238, the landowners of North Africa, pushed past bearing by an imperial tax official, killed him and proclaimed the elderly governor of the province as emperor. The governor's name was Gordian. He was around 80 years old, and he accepted with his son as co-ruler. The Senate, which had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening, immediately and enthusiastically confirmed them both. 3 weeks later, the governor of the neighboring province, who remained loyal to Maximinus, marched on Carthage. The younger Gordian was killed in the fighting outside the city. When the news reached his father, the old man hanged himself with his own belt. The Senate was now in open revolt against a sitting emperor with an army, and its chosen alternatives were both dead. So it appointed 2 of its own members as joint emperors. And when the population of Rome rioted against a pair of aristocrats nobody had voted for, it added the dead Gordian's 13-year-old grandson as a third. Maximinus marched on Italy. He got as far as Aquileia, where the city closed its gates and held. His army sat outside the walls through the spring, ran out of food, and killed him in his tent. The same solution his own men had applied to Alexander Severus 3 years earlier. Within 3 months, the 2 senatorial emperors were dead too, hacked apart by the Praetorian Guard, and the 13-year-old was the sole ruler of the Roman world. 6 emperors in a single year. And the significant thing is not the chaos itself, but what the chaos revealed. There was no longer any agreed mechanism for deciding who should rule. Not birth, not adoption, not senatorial appointment, not popular acclamation. Every one of those had been tried, and everyone had failed inside 12 months. All that remained was force, and force was distributed across a dozen frontier armies who could not consult each other and had no reason to agree. The empire had become a building with no load-bearing wall. It stayed up because of habit, and because everyone inside it was standing very still. Then the ground began to move. In the east, something had changed that Rome was slow to appreciate. For nearly 3 centuries, its eastern neighbor had been Parthia, a loose, feudal, frequently distracted kingdom that Rome had fought many times and never seriously feared. In the 220s, a Persian noble named Ardashir overthrew the Parthian king and founded a new dynasty, the Sassanids. They were centralized where the Parthians had been diffuse, ideological where the Parthians had been pragmatic, and they regarded the entire eastern Mediterranean as territory that had belonged to Persia under Darius and would belong to Persia again. For the first time in its history, Rome had a neighbor with comparable resources, comparable organization, and a stated intention to take its provinces. On the northern frontiers, a different kind of change. The tribal world beyond the Rhine and the Danube had been consolidating for generations. Small groups absorbed into larger confederations, and those confederations under pressure from populations moving behind them. The names that appear in Roman records shift accordingly. Where 2nd century writers list dozens of small peoples, 3rd century writers describe Alemanni, Franks, and Goths, coalitions large enough to break a frontier rather than raid across it. In 251, the Emperor Decius met a Gothic army under a king named Cniva in the marshes at Abritus in what is now Bulgaria. His son was killed first. Then the Roman army was drawn into ground. It could not maneuver in and destroyed, and Decius died there with it. His body was never found. It was the first time in Roman history that an emperor had been killed in battle by a foreign enemy. Rome had lost battles before, famously, catastrophically, but the man at the top had always been somewhere else. That distance was gone now, and it would not come back. And underneath both of these, quieter and far more destructive than either, a disease. It arrived around 249 and lasted in waves for well over a decade. We know it as the Plague of Cyprian, after the Bishop of Carthage who described its symptoms in a sermon. The bowels giving way, the eyes burning, the extremities rotting, the hearing and sight failing in those who survived. What it actually was remains unknown. A viral hemorrhagic fever is the current best guess. At its height, contemporaries in Alexandria claim the city lost the majority of its population. That is almost certainly an exaggeration, but the scale is corroborated in a way that exaggeration is not. From the middle of the 3rd century, across the empire, the building stops. Inscriptions dry up. Public works cease. Tax rolls shrink. Cities that had spilled out beyond their old boundaries during 2 centuries of peace pull back inside walls they hurriedly build, and the walls enclose a fraction of what the city had been. An emperor facing a Persian invasion, a Gothic breakthrough, and a plague needs soldiers and money. And the plague had just taken a substantial share of the men who would have supplied both. So the emperors did the only thing available to them. They debased the coinage. This deserves to be understood in detail, because it is the single mechanism that turned a military crisis into a systemic one. Under Augustus, the silver denarius had been almost pure, something close to 98% silver. Under Septimius Severus, 50%. Caracalla, needing to pay the army raise he could not afford, introduced a new coin, the Antoninianus, marked as worth 2 denarii, but containing the silver of about 1.5. That worked, briefly, in the way that all such tricks work briefly. By the 260s, the Antoninianus was a bronze disc with a wash of silver on the surface, perhaps 2% by weight, and the wash wore off in circulation. The state was paying its soldiers in tokens. The soldiers noticed. So did everyone else. Prices in Egypt, where the papyrus record allows us to actually measure this, rose by a factor of somewhere between 5 and 10 across the century, and the state's own tax revenues, assessed in money, became worth progressively less at exactly the moment the state needed them most. Rome's response was to begin collecting taxes in kind instead: grain, leather, iron, uniforms, requisitioned directly from the provinces and delivered to the army. That solved the immediate problem and dismantled something fundamental. A monetary economy is what had made the empire a single unit. What let a merchant in Alexandria trade with a merchant in Ostia, what made the provinces interdependent rather than merely adjacent. Replacing it with requisition turned the empire back into a collection of regions, each supporting the troops nearest to it. And regions that supply their own armies do not need a distant emperor. The breakdown, when it came from the top. In the year 260, the Emperor Valerian met Shapur I near Edessa. Accounts differ on whether it was a battle or a negotiation that turned into an ambush. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Valerian was taken alive, along with much of his staff, and he never came back. Shapur had the moment carved into a cliff face at Naqshi Rustam, where it can still be seen. The Persian king sits mounted. A Roman emperor kneels before him, with his hands raised. Later Roman writers, mostly Christian ones with an interest in the fate of a persecutor, added that Shapur used him as a mounting block for his horse, and that when he died, his skin was stuffed and kept in a temple. Those details may be true and may be propaganda. There is no way to know. The propaganda hardly mattered. The fact was sufficient. A Roman emperor was a prisoner in Persia, and Rome could not get him back, and everyone in the empire knew both things. What happened next was not rebellion so much as triage. In the West, the commander on the Rhine, Postumus, was proclaimed by his troops, and Gaul, Britain, and Spain went with him. He did not march on Rome. He did not claim the empire. He set up a Roman state with a senate, consuls, and coinage in the Roman style. And he defended the Rhine frontier, which the central government, occupied in the east, was not defending. His subjects had a plain reason to prefer him. He was there. In the east, the crisis was met by a client ruler. Odaenathus of Palmyra, a caravan city in the Syrian desert, grown enormously rich on the trade between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, took his own forces against Shapur, drove him back, and recovered Roman territory that Rome had failed to hold. He was rewarded with grand titles and effective authority over the whole Roman East, and he remained formally loyal until his assassination in 267. His widow, Zenobia, ruling in the name of their young son, was less interested in formality. Within 4 years, she had taken Egypt, which fed Rome and most of Asia Minor. So by the year 270, the Roman Empire existed in 3 pieces: a Gallic Empire in the west, a Palmyrene one in the east, and in the middle, Italy, Africa, and the Balkans, ruled from Rome by men who could not reach the other 2. It is worth saying clearly that neither breakaway state was trying to destroy Rome. Both were Roman in language, law, and self-conception. Both were doing the job the central government had stopped doing, which was keeping the enemy out. That is precisely what should worry anyone examining this period. The empire did not fragment because people stopped believing in it. It fragmented because being Roman had come to mean less, practically, than being defended. And in Rome itself, in 271, the Emperor Aurelian began building a wall around the capital. The city had not needed walls for 500 years. The old ones, from the 4th century before Christ, had long since been built over and through. Rome's defense had been distance, and the legions, and the idea that a barbarian army could reach Italy was not a thing Romans had needed to think about since Hannibal. Aurelian thought about it because a Germanic force had come through the Alps 2 years earlier and beaten a Roman army in northern Italy. The wall he built ran 19 kilometers, 6 meters high, before it was later raised higher with a tower every 30 meters. Much of it still stands. There is no clearer artifact of what the 3rd century had done. The capital of the Mediterranean world, walled by an emperor who did not think he could guarantee it was safe. Aurelian is the reason there is still an empire to discuss in part 3, and he did it in under 5 years. He came from the Danube provinces, from a peasant family. and had risen through the cavalry, one of a group of tough Illyrian officers who supplied most of the competent emperors of this period. He drove the Germanic invaders out of Italy. He decided that the province of Dacia, north of the Danube and impossible to hold, would be abandoned, and withdrew its population south of the river, the first permanent surrender of Roman territory in the empire's history, and a decision that was almost certainly correct. Then he went east. He beat Zenobia's forces twice, at Imae and outside Emesa, took Palmyra and brought Zenobia back to Rome alive. Then he turned west, met the last Gallic emperor at Chalons, and took Gaul, Britain, and Spain back into the empire. Tetricus, who by that point seems to have wanted to lose, was also spared. Within 5 years, an empire that had been in 3 pieces was in 1 piece. The Senate voted him the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World, and for once the flattery was earned. He also attempted a currency reform, improving the silver content of the coinage, and it half worked, which was better than anything anyone had managed in 50 years. In 275, marching east to deal with Persia, Aurelian was murdered on the road in Thrace. The manner of it is almost too neat. His private secretary, a man named Eros, had been caught in some lie and was afraid of the punishment. Knowing his master's reputation for severity, he forged a document, a list of senior officers marked for execution, and showed it to the men whose names he had written. They believed it, and they killed the emperor in the road. And then they discovered there had never been any list. The restorer of the world was killed by a clerical forgery. Aurelian had proved something enormously important, which is that the empire was not beyond saving. The provinces had not wanted to leave. The armies could still win. The frontier could still be held. Everything that had come apart could be put back together by a competent man with enough energy. He had also proved the limit of that without meaning to. Everything he restored personally. He had to be in Italy, then in Syria, then in Gaul, then on the road to Persia, because in each of those places, the presence of the emperor was what made the difference. And a man can only be in one place. When he died on that road, everything he had rebuilt was held together by nothing except the next man's ability to do the same impossible thing. There followed 9 more years and 4 more emperors, none of whom lasted, one of whom was reportedly killed by lightning. 50 years after the soldiers walked into Alexander Severus's tent, the empire was still standing, and the accounting was brutal. The currency was worthless, and the economy had partly reverted to requisition. The population had been cut by plague. Cities across the west had shrunk behind emergency walls. A province had been abandoned. An emperor had died in Persian captivity, another on a battlefield against Goths, and dozens more at the hands of their own men. Rome itself was walled. But the deeper problem was not any of these. It was that Aurelian's achievement had demonstrated the flaw in the design, and demonstrated it in the most convincing way possible. By succeeding, the empire now had frontiers on the Rhine, the Danube, and the Euphrates that all required immediate attention from the emperor personally and were separated by months of travel. It had armies large enough to make emperors and scattered too widely to be supervised. It had a capital that was 1,000 miles from anywhere that mattered militarily. One man in one city could no longer do this job, and the 50-year proof of that was written in 50 dead emperors. Whoever came next would either accept that or die of it. In the year 284, the officers of the Imperial Guard proclaimed the commander of the cavalry, a Dalmatian of obscure birth in his late 30s, and he turned out to be the first man in a century who understood the problem as a problem of design rather than a run of bad luck. What he did about it saved the empire and cost more than anyone at the time could calculate. He had been born Diocles in Dalmatia to a family so obscure that later writers could only guess at it. A freedman's son, possibly, or the son of a scribe. He had no property, no ancestry, and no connections. Everything he had earned in the army, and by the age of about 38, he was commanding the cavalry of the imperial bodyguard. His first act as emperor was a murder committed in front of the assembled army. The previous emperor, Numerian, had died on the march east under circumstances nobody could explain. His death concealed for days inside a closed litter until the smell gave it away. Diocles accused the Praetorian prefect, Aper, of the killing, and then, on the tribunal, in full view of the troops, drew his sword and ran him through personally. Whether Aper was guilty is unknowable. What the act accomplished is not in doubt. It closed the question, it demonstrated that the new emperor would not hesitate, and it did so publicly enough that no one needed to be told twice. He then Latinized his name to Diocletian, marched west, defeated the last surviving rival, and sat down to do the thing that no one in 50 years had done, which was to ask why this kept happening. The answer he arrived at was that the empire's problems were not a run of misfortune to be endured. They were structural, and they had a shape. The empire was too large for one man to defend. The frontiers were too far apart for one man to reach. The armies were too numerous for one man to watch. And because the office had no rules for succession, every ambitious general in the empire had a permanent, rational incentive to try for it. So he attacked the design. His first move was to stop pretending that one emperor was enough. In 285, he raised an old comrade, Maximian, to share the burden. The west to Maximian, the east to himself. 8 years later, he extended it. 2 senior emperors, 2 junior ones, each with a region and an army and a court. 4 men, 4 capitals, 4 frontiers covered simultaneously. The junior emperors were bound to the senior ones by marriage and by adoption, and were designated in advance as successors. That was the point of the whole arrangement. The throne would no longer be a prize to be seized. It would be an office to be inherited on schedule by a man who had already been doing the job for years. And none of the 4 capitals was Rome, Nicomedia in what is now Turkey, close to the Persian frontier, Milan, close to the Alpine passes, Trier on the Rhine, Sirmium on the Danube. Rome kept its senate, its temples, its grain dole, and its status as the sacred center of the world, and lost every practical function it had ever possessed. The emperors visited it. They did not live there. Diocletian himself set foot in the city once, in the 20th year of his reign, and left after a matter of weeks. The system worked. That is the fact that has to be sat with. For 20 years the frontiers held, the Persians were beaten, Britain was recovered from a usurper, the Danube was stabilized, and no emperor was murdered by his own troops. After the century that had just happened, this was close to a miracle. Now, the price. 4 emperors meant 4 courts, 4 bureaucracies, 4 sets of officials, guards, and hangers-on. The army was enlarged substantially. The exact figure is disputed, and the one contemporary who gives a number hated Diocletian, and probably exaggerated. But a near doubling is a reasonable estimate. The civil administration was expanded and multiplied in parallel. Provinces were cut into smaller pieces, roughly doubling their number, and grouped into new super-provinces under new officials, with civil and military authority now formally separated so that no single man could hold both in one region. That separation was another intelligent fix. A governor who commanded troops had been the raw material of 50 years of usurpation. Diocletian removed the raw material. But every one of these measures had to be paid for, and the empire that had to pay for them was the shrunken, plague-thinned, monetarily ruined empire of the 280s. So Diocletian rebuilt the tax system from the ground up, and it is here that the character of the cure becomes clear. The new system assessed land in standardized units of productive value, and people in units of labor, conducted a genuine empire-wide census, and, crucially, worked backwards from the state's requirements. The government would calculate what it needed, divide it across the assessed units, and issue the demand. This was a real administrative achievement. It was also the moment the Roman state stopped asking what its subjects could afford and began telling them what they owed. And because the assessment was tied to land and to trades, the state acquired an interest in people staying where they were. A farmer who left his fields made his land unproductive and his unit unaccessible. A shipper who abandoned the grain fleet left a hole in the supply of Rome. So they were made to stay. Tenant farmers were bound legally to the land they worked. Membership of essential trades, bakers, shippers, workers in the state arms factories and mines, became hereditary, passing from father to son as an obligation rather than a choice. A man born to a baker in Antioch would be a baker in Antioch, and so would his son. This developed over decades and was not the work of one edict or one emperor, but its logic was Diocletian's, and its direction was unmistakable. The empire had spent 3 centuries as a place where a Spanish provincial could become emperor, and a freedman's son could command the guard. It was becoming a place where your father's occupation was your sentence. The state had solved its funding problem by immobilizing its own society. Then, in 301, Diocletian tried to solve prices and produced the most instructive failure of his reign. The Edict on Maximum Prices set legal ceilings for something like 1,400 goods and services across the entire empire. Grain, wine, and oil. Wages for a carpenter, a scribe, a teacher of rhetoric. The cost of a lion, of a pair of boots, of freight per mile. The preamble is worth noticing for its tone. It blames the crisis on the greed of merchants, and it is written in the voice of a man genuinely angry at people he believes are looting his empire. The penalty for exceeding the ceilings was death. It failed immediately and completely. Merchants who could not sell at a profit did not sell. Goods left the open market. Where the price ceiling was below the cost of production, production stopped. Where enforcement was serious, people were executed, and the goods still did not appear. Within a few years, the edict was quietly abandoned. Diocletian had correctly identified that prices were destroying the empire's ability to function. He had entirely misdiagnosed the cause. The debasement was his predecessor's doing, and partly his own. And he had reached for the tool he understood, which was command. It is the recurring instinct of this whole period, and it is the reason the cure kept generating new diseases. A state that could no longer persuade, and could still compelled. Which brings us to the persecution. In February of 303, on the feast of the god Terminus, imperial officials demolished the church in Nicomedia, across the street from Diocletian's own palace. What followed was the most systematic attempt to destroy Christianity that the Roman state ever attempted. Scriptures were confiscated and burned. Churches were leveled. Clergy were arrested in numbers so large that the prisons overflowed and criminals had to be released to make room. A final edict required every inhabitant of the empire to sacrifice to the gods and produce a certificate proving it. It is tempting to read this as fanaticism, and it was not. Diocletian had spent 20 years restoring a shattered empire by demanding uniformity, one tax system, one command structure, one chain of authority. The empire had nearly died of fragmentation, and here was a large, growing, well-organized body of people who would not perform the single ritual act that signified membership in the Roman order. Within the logic of everything else he had built, it was consistent. It was also, in the plainest possible terms, a failure. The persecution was enforced ferociously in the east and half-heartedly in the west, where one of the four emperors, Constantius, did little more than knock down a few buildings. It produced martyrs, and martyrs produced conversions, and it did not reduce the number of Christians in the empire. 8 years later, dying of a horrific illness he seems to have interpreted as a judgment, Diocletian's successor, Galerius, issued an edict of toleration that admitted the whole campaign had achieved nothing. And by then, Diocletian was no longer emperor, because he had done the last and strangest thing of his reign. On the 1st of May, 305, he abdicated. He compelled his colleague, Maximian, to abdicate on the same day. The two junior emperors were promoted, 2 new juniors appointed, and the transfer took place peacefully and on schedule, exactly as designed. He is the only Roman emperor who ever voluntarily gave up the throne and lived. He retired to an enormous fortified palace he had built on the Dalmatian coast, near where he had been born, a structure so substantial that a city grew up inside its walls and is still there. When they came to him 3 years later, begging him to return and sort out the mess, he is supposed to have told them that if they could see the cabbages he had grown with his own hands, they would not ask. The mess was this. His system had one flaw, and it was fatal, and it was in the part he had cared most about. Diocletian had designed a succession based on merit and seniority, and had deliberately passed over the sons of the retiring emperors. Constantius had a grown son, Constantine, serving at Diocletian's own court. Maximian had a son, Maxentius. Neither was promoted. The whole point was that this was not a dynasty, but the armies were not committed to the theory. They were committed to the men they knew and the families they had served. In 306, barely a year after the abdication, Constantius died at York, and the troops in Britain immediately proclaimed his son. In Rome, the Praetorians and the population proclaimed Maxentius. There were now more emperors than the system had slots for, and no mechanism to remove the extras except the one that had killed 50 men in the previous century. The Tetrarchy lasted in a recognizable form for about 18 months after its architect went home. The wars that followed took 18 years to resolve, and the man who resolved them was Constantine. He is the pivot of this entire story, and it is worth being precise about what he actually changed, because his reputation has been carrying a great deal of weight for 17 centuries. In October of 312, he met Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge on the northern approach to Rome. He had crossed the Alps with a smaller army and won a string of engagements down the Italian peninsula, and Maxentius, for reasons that remain unclear, came out from behind the walls of Rome to fight him on open ground with the Tiber at his back. The bridge had been partly dismantled and replaced with a pontoon. When Maxentius's line broke, the pontoon gave way, and he drowned in the river in his armor, along with a large part of his army. Before the battle, Constantine had a vision. The two contemporary accounts do not agree. One describes a dream the night before, in which he was told to mark his soldiers' shields with a symbol of Christ. The other, a sign seen in the sky by the whole army, with words attached. They were written years apart by men with agendas, one of whom had the story from Constantine himself long after the fact. What is certain is that from that point onward, The Roman state stopped persecuting Christians and began funding them. The following year, Constantine and his Eastern colleague Licinius issued a declaration of toleration for all religions. Church property was returned. Bishops were given public funds, tax exemptions, and legal authority to hear cases. Enormous basilicas went up in Rome and Jerusalem at imperial expense, and in 325, when the church tore itself apart over the nature of Christ, it was the emperor who summoned 300 bishops to Nicaea, paid for their travel, sat in on the proceedings, and pressed them toward a settlement. Constantine was not baptized until he lay dying, 25 years later. Whether he was a convinced believer, a calculating politician who saw an organized network worth co-opting, or, most likely, a man who did not fully separate those things, is a question that has never been settled and probably cannot be. The consequence is not in doubt. In one generation, the religion that the empire had tried to exterminate became the religion that the empire underwrote. Diocletian's last great campaign for uniformity had been reversed and replaced by a different uniformity, and the institution that inherited the Roman habit of universal authority would outlive the Western Empire by 1,500 years. Constantine also fixed the money in a fashion. He introduced a new gold coin, the solidus, at a fixed weight, and he held that weight. It became the most stable currency in the world and remained so for the better part of 7 centuries. But notice who used it. Taxes on senators and merchants were increasingly demanded in gold. Soldiers and officials were paid in gold. The people at the bottom, buying bread, still handled bronze token coinage that continued to lose value. Constantine had not repaired the monetary system. He had built a sound currency for the state and the wealthy, and left everyone else in the wreckage of the old one. The gap between the top and the bottom of Roman society, already widening for a century, was now written into the coins themselves. And in 330, on the 11th of May, he dedicated a new capital. He chose the site of an old Greek colony called Byzantium on the European side of the Bosphorus, and the choice was superb. It sat on a peninsula, water on 3 sides, guarding the only sea route between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. It was close to the Danube frontier and close to the Persian one. It was surrounded by the richest and most populous provinces in the empire, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and it commanded the trade routes that made them rich. It could be walled across its landward side and, as events would prove for another 1100 years, held. He filled it with monuments looted from across the Greek world, gave it a senate, gave it a grain dole fed from Egypt, and named it after himself. He did not intend to divide the empire. He ruled all of it, alone, from 324 until his death, and Constantinople was meant as a capital for the whole Roman world, better placed than an old city on a river in central Italy. But an empire's center is where its money, its administration, and its emperor are, and all 3 had now moved permanently east. The gravitational pull of that decision would be felt for the next century and a half in a very simple way. When there was a crisis in the east, the resources were close at hand. When there was a crisis in the west, the resources were 1,000 miles away, in a court with its own frontiers to worry about. Constantine died in 337 and left the empire to 3 sons who fought each other. The empire he left them was stable, solvent at the top, defended, and administratively formidable. It was also a body with its heart in one half and its wounds in the other. The 3 sons did what sons of Roman emperors did. Within 3 years, the eldest was dead, killed invading his brother's territory. 10 years after that, the youngest was killed by a usurper, and the survivor, Constantius, spent the next several years fighting a civil war to put the empire back together. The decisive battle of that war was fought at Mursa on the Drava in 351. It was a Roman army against a Roman army, and by the estimate of a contemporary who had no reason to inflate it, more than 50,000 men died in a single day. Every one of them was a trained soldier of the Roman state, and everyone had been paid, equipped, and fed out of the tax revenues of provinces that were struggling to produce them. There is no barbarian invasion in this story. There is no plague. This was simply the empire spending its own army on the question of which Roman would rule it, and it never entirely recovered from the expenditure. That is the frame for everything in this part. From here, the Western Empire's central problem is not that its enemies became stronger. It is that it ran out of men and out of the money to hire them, and every solution it found to that shortage cost it something it could not get back. The two halves of the empire had begun to diverge in ways that went deeper than administration. The East held Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, densely populated, heavily urbanized, and rich. Egypt alone produced a grain surplus that could feed a capital. The eastern cities were old, numerous, and close together, connected by short sea routes, and they had never fully stopped using money the way the West had. Taxes there could be collected in coin, and coin could be used to hire soldiers wherever they were needed. The frontier the East had to defend was, in effect, the Persian one, and it faced a state that could be negotiated with, because it wanted the same things Rome did and understood treaties. The West had Britain, Gaul, Spain, Italy, and North Africa. It had fewer cities and smaller ones, and many of them had shrunk drastically during the 3rd century and never grown back. Its wealth was in land, concentrated in the hands of enormous aristocratic estates, whose owners had spent 2 centuries becoming extremely good at not paying tax. Its frontier was the Rhine and the Upper Danube, hundreds of miles of river, facing not one organized state, but dozens of shifting confederations that could not be negotiated with in any durable way, because there was no one with the authority to bind them. So the West had a longer frontier, a smaller revenue base, and a harder recruitment problem, and it had them all at once. The recruitment problem is worth dwelling on, because it is the specific thing that killed the Western Empire, and it is much less dramatic than the story usually allows. Roman law of this period contains a strange and revealing category of legislation. There are laws imposing penalties on men who cut off their own thumbs to avoid military service, and then later, laws requiring such men to serve anyway, because the practice had become common enough that simply exempting them created an obvious incentive. There are laws binding the sons of soldiers to their father's profession. There are laws penalizing landowners who hid their tenants from the recruiting officers, and laws penalizing officials who accepted bribes to overlook the hiding. You do not write laws like that unless the underlying problem is severe. Nobody wanted to serve in the army of the Western Empire, and the men who owned the manpower did not want to give it up. What the landowners wanted instead was to pay. And the state, needing money as badly as it needed men, let them. A landowner could discharge his recruitment obligation in gold, and the state would use the gold to hire soldiers elsewhere. Elsewhere meant across the river. This is the origin of the Federate system, and it needs to be understood without hindsight, because at the time it was neither desperate nor unusual. Rome had employed foreign auxiliaries for its entire history. Under the early empire, those men were recruited individually, put into Roman units, commanded by Roman officers, and issued Roman citizenship at the end of 25 years, by which time they and their sons were Romans in every sense. What changed in the 4th century was that the empire began hiring them wholesale, not individuals, but whole groups under their own chieftains, keeping their own organization and their own internal loyalties, paid and supplied by Rome, and fighting for Rome, but never absorbed by it. It was cheaper. It was faster. It solved the problem in front of the man who had to solve it. And it meant that a steadily increasing share of the Western army consisted of men whose commanders were not Roman officials, but their own leaders, who could be bargained with and who could take their armies elsewhere. Then, in 376, an enormous number of people arrived at the Danube and asked to come in. They were Goths, and they were running. Something had come out of the steppe behind them. The Huns, of whom the Romans knew almost nothing, except that the Gothic kingdoms east of the Danube had disintegrated in front of them within a few years. Tens of thousands of people, with their families, their carts, and their weapons, gathered on the northern bank and petitioned the Emperor Valens for permission to cross and settle inside the empire. Valens said yes, and the decision was not obviously foolish. He was preparing a campaign against Persia and needed troops. Here was a large body of experienced fighters offering to become taxpayers and recruits in exchange for land. Rome had settled defeated peoples inside its borders many times. The conditions were that they would surrender their weapons and hand over hostages and be fed and resettled by imperial officials. The officials were named Lupicinus and Maximus, and what they did is recorded by Ammianus Marcellinus, an army officer who was alive at the time and whose account of this period is the closest thing we have to a first-hand history. The weapons were not properly collected because the officials took bribes to let them through. The promised food was not delivered because the officials sold it instead at prices no refugee could pay. And when the Goths had nothing left to sell, the Romans sold them dog meat and took their children as slaves in payment. By Ammianus's account, 1 dog for 1 child. Within a year, the Goths were in open revolt, and they were armed, and they were inside the empire. On the 9th of August, 378, Valens brought the Eastern Field Army to meet them outside Adrianople in Thrace. His nephew Gratian, the Western Emperor, was marching to join him with reinforcements and was days away. Valens attacked without waiting. The Roman infantry advanced in the afternoon heat, having marched since dawn without food or water, against a Gothic wagon fort. While they were engaged, the Gothic cavalry, which had been out foraging and which Roman scouts had failed to locate, returned and struck the Roman flank. The Roman line was pushed together until the men in it could not raise their arms. Ammianus describes soldiers crushed so tightly that the dead stayed upright. 2/3 of the Eastern Field Army was destroyed. 35 senior officers died. Valens himself vanished, either killed on the field among his men, or, in the story that circulated afterward, carried wounded to a farmhouse that the Goths burned without knowing who was inside. Ammianus, who had spent his career in that army, called it the worst defeat since Cannae, 580 years earlier. What made it a turning point was not the casualties, terrible as they were. It was that the Goths were still there afterward. A defeat on the frontier could be repaired. The enemy withdrew and Rome rebuilt. This enemy had nowhere to withdraw to and no intention of leaving. Theodosius, the general Gratian appointed to deal with the situation, spent 4 years trying to defeat them and could not. So in 382, he made a treaty instead, and the terms of that treaty are the most consequential sentences in this entire century. The Goths would be settled on Roman soil in Thrace and Moesia, south of the Danube. They would keep their own leaders. They would not be dispersed into Roman units, but would serve as their own formations under their own commanders. They would be exempt from taxation, and they would supply troops to the Roman army when called. Every previous settlement of a defeated people had ended in their dissolution into the Roman population. This one did not. What Theodosius created was an armed, self-governing nation, living permanently inside the borders of the Roman Empire, subject to its own laws and its own kings, contractually obliged to fight for Rome and structurally capable of refusing. It is easy to call this a catastrophic mistake, and many Romans did at the time. It is harder to say what the alternative was. Theodosius had lost most of the Eastern army and could not raise another. He could not expel the Goths and could not destroy them. The treaty brought peace and it brought soldiers, and the men who criticized it were not the ones who had to find the troops, but it established a principle that the West would apply again and again over the next 70 years, each time with a weaker hand. When you cannot beat them, settle them, and hope the arrangement holds. Theodosius then spent much of the rest of his reign fighting Romans. There were 2 usurpations in the West during his reign, and he suppressed both. The second ended at the river Frigidus in the Julian Alps in September of 394, a 2-day battle against a Western Roman army, and the last full-scale civil war the United Empire ever fought. Theodosius won it, and the way he won it is the detail that matters. He put his Gothic federates in the front line on the first day and sent them in against the Western infantry. They took the losses. Estimates run to 10,000 Gothic dead, and the contemporary reaction on the Roman side was that this was an efficient outcome, a victory purchased with barbarian lives. The Goths drew a different conclusion, which was that Rome would spend them. Among the Gothic officers who fought at the Frigidus and survived it was a young commander named Alaric, who had expected a Roman generalship for his service and did not receive one. 4 months later, in January of 395, Theodosius died at Milan. He was 48. He had ruled the whole Roman world for 4 months. He left it to his sons. Arcadius in the east was about 18. Honorius in the west was 10. Neither was capable of governing, and the 2 courts that formed around them spent the following decade in a rivalry so bitter that each was, at various points, prepared to see the other lose a province rather than assist it. Theodosius was the last man to rule both halves of the Roman Empire. From this point, there are 2 emperors, permanently, and their governments do not cooperate. The accounting at the end of this century looks very different from the accounting at the end of the last one. There is no 50-year collapse, no plague, no captured emperor. The empire is administratively intact, the frontiers are formally held. The succession has passed peacefully to Theodosius's sons. What has actually happened is quieter. The West has spent its own manpower on civil wars it could not afford, and replaced it by hiring the people on the other side of the river. It has settled an armed foreign nation inside its borders because it had no way to remove it. It has spent that nation's soldiers freely enough that they have noticed. And it has just handed its government to a child in a court 1,000 miles from the emperor of the richer half, who will not help. The Western army that remains is a Roman institution in name, and in substance it is increasingly a coalition of contingents whose loyalty runs to the men who lead them, which is a workable arrangement as long as Rome does not kill those men. The man who governed the Western Empire for the next 13 years was the son of a Vandal cavalry officer. Stilicho had risen the way competent soldiers had risen since Diocletian, through the army, and Theodosius had trusted him enough to marry him to his own niece and, on his deathbed, to leave him the guardianship of a 10-year-old emperor. Stilicho claimed rather more than that. He insisted Theodosius had made him guardian of both sons, East and West, and the Eastern court never accepted it. That dispute poisoned relations between the two halves for the rest of his life, at precisely the moment when cooperation might have mattered. His ancestry is worth stating plainly because of what was eventually done with it, but it should not be overstated. Stilicho was a Roman. He had been born in the empire, served it his whole career, married into the imperial family, and held the highest military office in the West. Half the senior commanders of this period had similar backgrounds. In the Roman army of the late 4th century, this was ordinary. It stopped being ordinary when people needed someone to blame. His opponent for most of those years was Alaric, the Gothic commander who had fought at the Frigidus and been passed over afterward. Alaric's career is often described as an invasion, and that is not quite what it was. What he wanted consistently for 15 years was a Roman command, a permanent grant of land for his people, and a regular allowance of grain. He wanted, in other words, to be inside the system rather than outside it. When he could not get these things by negotiation, he took an army and made himself expensive enough to negotiate with. He invaded Greece, and Stilicho came after him twice, and both times was ordered to withdraw by an Eastern court that preferred a Gothic problem in the Balkans to a Western general in its territory. He invaded Italy in 401, and Stilicho beat him at Pollentia on Easter Sunday, and again at Verona the following year, and both times let him go. This was held against Stilicho, then and since. But his reasoning is not hard to reconstruct. Destroying Alaric's army would have cost more men than the West could spare, and Alaric's army was itself a potential asset, a large body of experienced soldiers who wanted to be hired. Stilicho was trying to convert an enemy into a component of the Western military establishment, which was exactly what the empire had been doing for 50 years. It was the right policy. It also required the court to eventually give Alaric something, and the court never did. One thing did change in those years, permanently. In 402, with Alaric loose in northern Italy, the Emperor Honorius moved his residence from Milan to Ravenna. Ravenna sat behind marshes on the Adriatic, accessible by sea and effectively unassailable by a land army without a fleet. It was an excellent military decision and a disastrous political one. For the next 70 years, the Western emperors would sit in a coastal fortress, physically safe, watching their empire come apart at a distance they could not be reached across. The court at Ravenna became a place where the crisis was always somewhere else. In 405, a Gothic king named Radagaisus crossed into Italy with a very large force, and Stilicho destroyed him at Faesulae the following summer. It was his greatest victory. To assemble the army for it, he pulled troops off the Rhine frontier. On the last day of December, 406, the Rhine frontier gave way. A coalition of Vandals, Alans and Sueves crossed the river near Mainz, in numbers, with their families. The traditional detail is that they walked across the frozen river, and it may well be true, though the sources are late and the ice is not securely attested. The date and the fact are not in question. What is not in question either is that there was very little behind the river to stop them, because a substantial part of what should have been there had been marched to Italy the previous year to fight Radagaisus. This is the through line of the entire century in one event. The fix worked. Radagaisus was annihilated, Italy was saved, and the resources that made it work had been taken from the frontier, and the frontier broke. Every one of these decisions was correct in isolation. There were not enough men to make all of them at once. They were never expelled. That is what makes this different from every previous frontier breach. The Vandals and their allies moved through Gaul for 2 years, then crossed the Pyrenees into Spain and settled. Roman Gaul was never again what it had been on the 30th of December, 406. Within a year, the garrison of Britain, watching Gaul dissolve and receiving no instructions, proclaimed its own emperor, a soldier they named Constantine, largely because of the name, and took the British field army across the Channel to try to hold the Rhine themselves. The troops did not come back. Britain, which had been Roman for 3.5 centuries, was simply left. There was no withdrawal, no ceremony, no decision. There was a garrison that departed and a government that never replaced it. Then, in 408, the Western Empire destroyed itself in the space of a fortnight. The Eastern Emperor Arcadius died that May, leaving a 7-year-old heir. Stilicho proposed to go east and manage the situation, and to use Alaric, who was demanding payment for a campaign that had been cancelled, as the instrument. He persuaded the Senate to vote Alaric £4,000 of gold over open objection, and at least one senator said out loud that this was not peace, but servitude. A court official named Olympius used the opening. He worked on Honorius, now 23, and entirely unequal to his position, and told him what the emperor was already inclined to believe, that Stilicho had been managing him, that the accommodation with Alaric was collusion, that a man with a Vandal father who kept sparing Gothic armies had been serving his own people all along. In August, the army at Ticinum mutinied and killed Stilicho's supporters in the government. Stilicho was at Bologna with Federate troops who offered to fight for him. He forbade it, went to Ravenna, took sanctuary in a church, and was arrested when the officials produced an imperial warrant. He walked out and let them execute him. His son was hunted down and killed shortly after. Whether he could have won a civil war is unknowable. He seems to have concluded that a civil war was what would finish the West, and to have accepted the alternative. What followed was worse than the execution. Roman garrisons across northern Italy turned on the families of the Federate soldiers, the wives and children of the barbarian troops in Roman service, living in the Italian cities under the arrangement that had made those troops available. They were massacred. The soldiers were in the field. When they learned what had been done, roughly 30,000 of them marched out of the Roman army and joined Alaric. The Western court had spent a decade unable to raise enough men to defend Gaul. In a single act of hysteria, it had transferred an entire field army to its enemy and destroyed the only commander who had ever beaten him. Alaric came down into Italy in the autumn and put Rome under siege. He had not come to destroy it. He came, as he had come for 15 years, to be paid. He blockaded the city, cut the grain, waited until the Senate sent envoys, and named his price. He got gold, silver, silk, hides, and 3,000 pounds of pepper, and he withdrew. Then he asked Ravenna for a settlement, land for his people in Noricum, a modest annual allowance of grain, and a Roman generalship for himself. It was less than he had demanded in previous years. Honorius refused. Alaric reduced the terms, a poorer province, less grain, no title. Honorius refused again. There is an exchange recorded in which the emperor's representatives explained that a man of Alaric's origin could not hold such a command, and Alaric replied that he was not asking for what he could take. He besieged the city a second time and installed a puppet emperor of his own, and when that produced nothing either, he tried once more. The refusals were not cowardice, they were something closer to the opposite. The court at Ravenna had decided that the Roman state did not treat with barbarians on those terms, and it held that position through 3 sieges of its own former capital. It was defending a principle from behind marshes with an army it did not have. On the 24th of August, 410, someone opened the Salarian gate from the inside, and the Goths entered Rome. The sack lasted 3 days. By the standards of ancient warfare, it was restrained. Alaric was a Christian, and he ordered the great basilicas of Peter and Paul to be respected as sanctuary, and a substantial part of the population sheltered in them and survived. There was no general massacre. There was extensive looting, some burning, some killing, and the enslavement of a great many people. The emperor's sister, Galla Placidia, was taken away as a hostage and would eventually marry a Gothic king. Measured as a destruction, it was survivable. Rome had not been the capital for over a century. It contained no emperor, no treasury, no army, and no strategic asset whatsoever. Nothing that mattered to the functioning of the Western Empire was lost in those 3 days. And it did not matter, because it was never about that. The city of Rome had not fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years, not since the Gauls in the 4th century before Christ. In a time so remote, it was half legend. 8 centuries of accumulated meaning attached to that fact. Rome was the thing that did not fall. It was the fixed point that the rest of the world was measured against. And educated men across the Mediterranean had spent their whole lives inside that assumption without ever having to examine it. Jerome, in his cell in Bethlehem, translating scripture, wrote that when the news came, he could not work, could not speak, and did not know what to say. He was an old man who had lived in Rome, and he wrote about it repeatedly for the rest of his life, always in the same register of disbelief. In North Africa, Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, heard the refugees arriving from Italy and heard the accusation that came with them, that Rome had fallen because it had abandoned its old gods for the Christian one, and that the empire's disaster was the price of its conversion. 3 years later, he began writing an answer, and the answer took him 13 years and 22 books. The argument of the city of God is that the earthly city was always going to fall, that no political order is eternal, and that mistaking Rome for a permanent thing had been the error all along. It is the most important book to come out of the Western Empire's collapse, and it exists because a city that no longer governed anything was looted for 3 days. Alaric marched south, intending to cross to Africa and take the grain supply. His fleet was wrecked in a storm, and he died within months, still without the land and the title he had spent 15 years asking for. His men are said to have diverted a river to bury him in its bed, and then let the water back over the grave, though that story appears in a source written more than a century later and has the shape of legend. The empire went on. Honorius remained emperor for another 13 years in Ravenna, behind the marshes. The years from 406 to 410 had settled several things permanently. The Rhine frontier was gone and would not be restored. Britain was gone. Gaul and Spain now contained armed peoples who were not leaving. The one commander capable of managing the situation had been killed by his own government, and his death had handed 30,000 soldiers to the enemy. And the West had demonstrated something about itself that the men on its payroll could not unlearn. It had shown that a general of barbarian descent, however loyal, however successful, could be executed on a courtier's word, and that the families of Federate soldiers in Roman service could be murdered in Roman cities without consequence. The Western Empire still needed those men. It needed them more every year. It had just taught all of them exactly what their service was worth. The Western Empire did not die of the sack of Rome. It lived for another 66 years, and for a good part of that time, it looked as though it might recover. Honorius died in 423, having achieved nothing in 28 years except survival. The Eastern government installed his 6-year-old nephew, Valentinian, on the Western throne, with his mother, Galla Placidia, the same woman the Goths had carried off from Rome, as regent. The Visigoths had been given a permanent settlement in southwestern Gaul, around Toulouse, on the by now familiar terms: their own king, their own laws, an obligation to fight for Rome. Much of Gaul and Spain had been brought back under some form of imperial authority. It was diminished, but it was functioning. What killed it was not a single blow. It was the loss of the one province the Western Empire could not do without, and the slow discovery that its own government was more dangerous to its defenders than any enemy. In 429, the Vandals crossed from Spain into Africa. There were perhaps 80,000 of them, counting families, under a king named Gaiseric, who would turn out to be the most capable enemy Rome faced in the 5th century. They moved east along the coast, taking the cities one by one. Augustine died during the siege of his own city, Hippo, in 430, an old man listening to the walls. 6 years later, Rome made a treaty conceding them a substantial part of the region, on the assumption that a settled Vandal kingdom could be managed like the others. On the 19th of October, 439, in a time of formal peace, Gaiseric took Carthage by surprise. It is difficult to overstate what this meant, and it is the single most important event in the fall of the Western Empire. More important than Adrianople, more important than the Rhine, incomparably more important than the sack of Rome. Roman Africa was the richest province in the West. It had been spared the 3rd century catastrophes, spared the Rhine breach, spared the Gothic wars. Its cities were intact and prosperous, while Gaul's had shrunk. It supplied the grain that fed the city of Rome, and it supplied tax revenue in gold at a level no other Western province came close to. The Western Empire's fundamental problem for a century had been that it could not afford soldiers. Africa was where a large share of the money to pay them came from, and now it belonged to someone else, someone who could not be dislodged, because Gaiseric immediately did something no barbarian king had done. He built a fleet. Within a few years, the Vandals controlled the Western Mediterranean. They took Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the Balearics. They raided the Italian coast at will. The sea that had been a Roman lake for 600 years, the thing that had made the empire a single connected body, was now hostile water. 2 great expeditions were mounted to take Africa back, one in the 440s and one in the 460s, and both failed, and the second one cost the Eastern Empire so much that it could not try again. Everything after 439 is the Western Empire trying to fight a war it can no longer pay for. The man who held it together anyway was Aetius, and he is the last figure in this story who deserves to be called great. He had spent part of his youth as a hostage among the Huns, and he understood them and their leaders personally, an asset no other Roman possessed. He had come to power the way everyone did now, by winning a civil war against his rivals within the Roman command, and at one point by fleeing to the Huns and returning with a Hunnic army at his back to enforce his claim. He then spent 20 years holding the West together with a method that was less a strategy than a permanent improvisation. Play the barbarian kingdoms against one another. Hire the ones you need, break the ones you can, and never let any of them become strong enough to stand alone. It was not glorious, and it worked. Under Aetius, the Visigoths were kept in Aquitaine. The Franks were checked on the Rhine, rebellions in Gaul were suppressed, and the Western Empire, which by any reasonable measure was insolvent, continued to exist. Then, in 451, Attila came west. The Huns had spent 30 years extorting the Eastern Empire. and under Attila they had become an empire of their own, drawing tribute in gold at a scale that beggars comparison. Having exhausted what the East would pay, Attila turned toward Gaul, with an army drawn from every people he had subjugated. Aetius met him on the Catalonian plains, somewhere in the region of Chalons, in June. And the composition of the army he brought is the truest single fact about the late Western Empire. It was not, in any substantial sense, a Roman army. Its core was the Visigoths of Toulouse under their king Theodoric, together with Franks, Burgundians, Alans, and Sarmatians. The peoples Rome had been fighting, hiring, and settling for 80 years, assembled by a Roman general against a common threat. The battle was enormous and inconclusive in the technical sense. Theodoric was killed. Attila withdrew to his camp and was not pursued, but he left Gaul and he did not come back to it. He came to Italy instead the following year and sacked Aquileia so thoroughly that the survivors are said to have founded the settlements that became Venice. What stopped him there was disease in his army, a failing supply situation, and an eastern attack on his rear, though the tradition remembers instead the embassy that met him at the river Mincio, led by Pope Leo, and the meeting in which the Bishop of Rome persuaded the most feared man in the world to turn around. Attila did turn around. Whether Leo was the reason is a question the sources do not settle. Attila died the next year, on his wedding night, of a hemorrhage. His empire fell apart within 2 years, because it had been held together by nothing except him. So had Aetius's. In September of 454, Valentinian III, now 35, an emperor for 29 years, summoned Aetius to the palace in Rome to discuss finances. When the general began to speak, the emperor drew his sword and struck him, and his chamberlain struck him too. And between them, they killed the man who had held the Western Empire together for 2 decades. Valentinian had convinced himself that Aetius intended to take the throne, which he had never attempted in 20 years of opportunity. Afterwards, the emperor asked a courtier whether he had done well, and the courtier is supposed to have told him that he had cut off his right hand with his left. 6 months later, riding on the Campus Martius, Valentinian was cut down by 2 of Aetius's former retainers, and nobody in his guard, many of them Aetius's men, moved to help him. The Theodosian dynasty ended there, and with it any remaining principle by which a Western emperor might be recognized as legitimate. Gaiseric, in Carthage, heard that the emperor who had signed his treaty was dead and sailed for Rome. The Vandals entered the city in June of 455 and stayed for 14 days. Pope Leo met them at the gates as he had met Attila, and obtained a promise of no burning and no massacre, and by all accounts, Gaiseric kept it. What followed was not a sack in the sense of frenzy. It was a methodical removal of assets by men who had come with ships and time. They stripped the gilded bronze tiles from the roof of the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitol. They took the imperial regalia, the treasures of the palaces, and the accumulated valuables of 8 centuries. And they took thousands of skilled people as slaves, and the widow and daughters of the dead emperor. Alaric's 3 days in 410 are the sack that history remembers. Gaiseric's 14 days took far more. The remaining 21 years are the most dispiriting stretch in Roman history, and they can be described briefly because the pattern does not change. There was a general named Ricimer, of Visigothic and Suevic royal descent, who commanded what was left of the Italian army from 456 until his death in 472. Being of barbarian birth and an Arian Christian, he could not take the throne himself. So he appointed men who could, and removed them when they disagreed with him, and appointed others. Over 16 years, he made and unmade emperors, the way the Praetorians had done 2.5 centuries earlier, except that there was no longer an empire large enough for anyone else to object. One of the men he appointed was worth something. Majorian, emperor from 457 to 461, was the last Western emperor who tried to reverse the situation rather than merely survive it. He restored imperial authority across much of Gaul and Spain by campaigning in person. He passed laws against the corruption of tax collection and against the demolition of Rome's ancient buildings for construction material. And he built a fleet at Cartagena, 300 ships, for the one operation that could have saved the West, which was the recovery of Africa. Gaiseric learned where the fleet was from men inside Majorian's own administration and destroyed it at anchor before it sailed. Majorian made peace, disbanded his army, and was arrested by Ricimer on the road back to Italy and executed 5 days later. There was one more attempt. In 468, the Eastern Empire, under an emperor who understood that the West could not be saved without Africa, assembled the largest amphibious expedition of the century, over 1,000 ships, funded at a cost that reportedly emptied the Eastern treasury. Gaiseric asked for a 5-day truce to consider terms, used it to prepare fireships, and destroyed the fleet in the Bay of Cape Bon. That was the end of any realistic prospect of recovery, and everyone involved knew it. The East never tried again. The West had nothing left to try with. By the 470s, the Western Empire consisted of Italy, a portion of Gaul, and some coastal fragments. Its army in Italy was almost entirely Federate, Germanic soldiers in Roman service, drawing pay from a government whose tax base had shrunk to a fraction of what it had been. In 475, a Roman officer named Orestes, who had once been Attila's secretary, took control of that army, drove out the reigning emperor, and installed his own son on the throne. The boy was in his early teens. His name was Romulus, and because of his youth, the soldiers called him by a diminutive, Augustulus, the little Augustus. The last emperor of the Western Roman Empire carried the name of the man who founded the city and the name of the man who founded the empire, in a form that meant the small one. History rarely arranges itself this neatly, and it should be treated with suspicion, but in this case the names are simply what they were. The Federate soldiers in Italy then asked Orestes for what the Goths had been given in Gaul, and the Vandals in Africa, and the Burgundians on the Rhone. A permanent settlement, land of their own, a third of Italy. Orestes refused. It was the last time a Roman government asserted the principle that soldiers of barbarian origin could not be given the soil of Italy. The army proclaimed one of its own officers, Odoacer, as its king. And in August of 476, it killed Orestes at Placentia. On the 4th of September, Odoacer took Ravenna and deposed the boy. And then he did the thing that ends this story, which was nothing. He did not kill Romulus. He gave him a pension and sent him to live on an estate in Campania, and no source records when or how he died. He did not proclaim a new emperor, and he did not take the title himself. Instead, he gathered the imperial regalia of the Western Empire and sent it to Constantinople, with a message to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, explaining that the West no longer required an emperor of its own, that one emperor was sufficient for both halves, and asking to be recognized as the administrator of Italy under Eastern authority. There was no battle for Rome. There was no siege, no massacre, no burning. The Senate continued to meet. The consuls continued to be appointed. Taxes were collected. Courts sat. The grain came in. And the city of Rome went on exactly as it had the week before, under a German king who governed in the name of an emperor in Constantinople. Almost nobody at the time thought anything final had happened. The chroniclers of the period record the year without emphasis. There had been emperor makers before, and puppet emperors before, and years without a legitimate ruler before. As far as the evidence goes, the people alive in Italy in the autumn of 476 did not know they were living at the end of the Roman Empire, and it would take 50 years before anyone wrote it down that way. The date is a convenience assigned afterward, but something real is being marked by it. From that September, there was never again a Roman emperor in the West. The office simply stopped being filled because nobody needed it, and the machinery it had once directed had already passed piece by piece into other hands. So it is worth returning, at the end, to the question this story began with. Nothing killed the Roman Empire from outside. There is no invasion in these 3 centuries that Rome at its height could not have absorbed. Attila was turned back. The Goths at Adrianople numbered a fraction of what Rome had faced and destroyed under the Republic. The Vandals who took Africa and broke the Western economy amounted to perhaps 80,000 people, including women and children, against an empire that had once counted 60 million. What defeated Rome was the accumulated cost of 300 years of correct decisions. Septimius Severus was right that the army was the only thing holding the state together, and paying it properly was the only sane response. And that lesson taught 50 years of soldiers that emperors could be killed and replaced at will. The emperors of the 3rd century were right to debase the coinage, because the alternative was a mutiny they could not survive, and it destroyed the monetary economy that made the empire a single unit. Diocletian was right that no one man could govern this, and right to divide the office, and the division became a permanent fracture. He was right to systematize taxation, and the system froze Roman society into hereditary obligation. Constantine was right that the empire's center of gravity had moved east, and moving the capital there left the West without one. Theodosius was right that he could not destroy the Goths and had to settle them, and settled an armed nation inside the borders. The Western landowners were right that paying gold was easier than surrendering their tenants, and the gold hired soldiers who belonged to someone else. Stilicho was right to strip the Rhine to save Italy, and the Rhine broke. Every one of those choices addressed the crisis in front of it. Every one of them was defensible, and most were the best available, and every one of them transferred a cost forward to a government that would be poorer, smaller, and more desperate than the one that made the decision. That is the whole shape of it. Rome did not fall because its people grew decadent, or lost their virtue, or forgot their gods, which is what Romans themselves said, and what has been repeated ever since. It fell because a state under permanent pressure will always choose the solution that gets it through the next year, and because it did that for 300 years, and because the bill for each solution came due long after the men who had signed for it were dead. The empire in the east, which had the money and the shorter frontier and the better capital, went on for another 1,000 years. In the west, the roads stayed where they were. The aqueducts ran until they broke, and then they were not repaired. The villas were farmed for a while by people who could not read the inscriptions on them. And the towns went on shrinking inside walls that had been built in a hurry 200 years earlier. by men who thought they were solving a temporary problem.